Perfect Friend. Chapter 1. The Discovery. I was standing in our bedroom, one of those ordinary mornings where nothing feels amiss, folding Greg's jacket to hang in the closet. That's when it fell. A receipt, curled and wrinkled, landing on the floor like some sort of twisted confession. At first, I ignored it, brushing it off as just another scrap of paper. But then I noticed the date and the place. An intimate, candlelit restaurant downtown. I froze. This wasn't our restaurant. This wasn't a receipt from a night we'd spent together. I stared at it, trying to make sense of this. He'd told me he was working late that night, some project or deadline he couldn't escape. But this receipt said otherwise. My mind raced, desperate to rationalize it. Maybe he'd had a business dinner there? But I knew Greg's work habits well. His business meetings were usually with clients or coworkers, places with quick service and a tight, no-nonsense vibe, not a spot known for secluded booths and dimly lit ambience. I put down the receipt, heart pounding, trying to shake off the possibility twisting in my mind. I could feel my throat tighten, like every inch of trust I'd ever given him was suddenly choking me. I tried to remember every detail, every conversation we'd had that night. I'd waited up for him, actually, thinking he'd come home tired, that we'd spend a few quick minutes catching up before heading to bed. But he hadn't been tired. He'd seemed almost distant, like his mind was elsewhere. I sat down, still gripping that slip of paper, as 1,000 tiny memories came together like pieces in a puzzle. The late nights, the suddenly guarded phone, the way he'd started coming home smelling of cologne I hadn't bought him. I felt like I was waking up from a dream, seeing everything in a new, harsh light, like I'd been blind this whole time, content to live in a haze of trust one hadn't questioned. And yet, some stubborn part of me tried to push it away. Surely, I thought, I couldn't accuse him of something this serious based on a receipt. A single receipt could mean anything. I could confront him right now, but he'd probably find some excuse, tell me I was paranoid, that I was jumping to conclusions. And honestly, I knew I wasn't ready to hear that. I wasn't ready to believe it. Instead, something in me shifted. I felt my mind clearing, and a resolve began to form. If there was something going on, I wasn't going to ruin everything on a hunch. I wanted to know for sure, not rely on speculation or let my fears run away with me. I needed evidence, clarity. After years of standing by his side, giving him my absolute trust, I figured I at least owed myself that. I'd be patient, careful. I'd watch him, let him give himself away if he really was hiding something. I'd be his supportive wife, his trusting Sarah, the woman who wouldn't dream of suspecting a thing. I'd gather the truth little by little, enough to confront him without any wiggle room for lies. With each passing day, I noticed the small changes even more. His phone was always glued to him now, notifications silenced. He'd started dressing better, paying more attention to his looks when he headed out. When I asked about his day, he was vague, like he was feeding me details from a script. Sometimes, after these long business nights, he'd return home with a look I'd never seen before. It was subtle, but it was there. A mixture of excitement and guilt, as if he was hiding a secret he loved and hated at the same time. Then there was the way he'd started pulling away from me. We used to share everything, from jokes to secrets to the most mundane thoughts. But now, conversations were short, and he was so easily distracted, like I was only half of what occupied his mind. I tried to act normal, like I hadn't noticed a thing, though every night I lay awake beside him, my mind racing. One morning, I decided I'd had enough of playing the guessing game and went into his study while he was at work. I searched his desk drawers, feeling a pang of guilt, but each passing moment made my suspicions harder to ignore. I didn't find much, a few receipts, some old documents, nothing of real significance. But then I checked his browsing history on his desktop and saw reservations at another intimate restaurant, for a date I remembered clearly. He told me he was visiting his brother that night. My fingers trembled as I read through it, anger and sadness welling up inside me. He'd been lying, and I was starting to get a clearer picture. It wasn't just a lapse in judgment or a one-time mistake. This was planned, premeditated, a whole other life unfolding in the shadows of ours. Still, I held back. I hadn't yet seen him with her, whoever she was, and if I confronted him now, he'd deny it, maybe even paint me as paranoid, making a mountain out of a molehill. And if he knew I was onto him, he might just take the affair deeper underground, becoming even more cautious, leaving me with no real way to expose the truth. So, I decided to take things into my own hands, to play the long game. I'd find her. I'd get to know her, somehow. If I could figure out who she was, maybe even befriend her, I'd finally understand everything Greg had been hiding from me. I wanted the truth. No, I needed it. But I was also starting to feel something else. A need for justice, maybe even revenge. For years, I'd been the supportive wife, the one who put everyone else first, even when I felt neglected or unappreciated. And now, here I was, piecing together the wreckage of my marriage, feeling like I was being buried under the weight of my own memories. I decided then that I wasn't going to let him ruin this without a fight. I wasn't going to let him get away with betraying me, breaking our trust, and then continuing on as if nothing had happened. I thought about the years we'd spent together, the way I'd loved him, trusted him completely. It felt like a cruel joke. All the time we'd shared, the plans we'd made. It all seemed like some elaborate facade now, like he'd been playing a role while his heart belonged somewhere else. But I couldn't think about that right now, couldn't let it break me. I needed to stay strong, keep my mind sharp and focused. The next day, as I watched him leave for another late night at the office, I couldn't help but feel a new clarity. The feeling of helplessness faded, replaced by something darker, something that urged me to play this game my way. I wasn't going to sit back and wait for him to come clean. No, if there was a betrayal lurking in the shadows, I'd drag it into the light myself. And maybe, just maybe, I'd find a way to make him regret every choice that led us to this moment. Chapter 2. The Accidental Meeting. Sarah parked down the street from the restaurant listed on the receipt, her eyes glued to the entrance from the tinted windows of her car. She felt like an imposter, the adrenaline of spying for the first time both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. Every time the door opened, her pulse quickened as she watched people come and go, families laughing, couples holding hands, groups of friends sharing drinks and secrets. The receipt felt heavier than a stone in her pocket, and every time her fingers brushed against it, her chest tightened. She hadn't planned beyond this. No confrontation, no real plan. Just this urge to see, to understand what kind of person her husband could betray her with. A nagging thought lingered. What if she was nothing like what Sarah had imagined? What if she was beautiful, warm, and everything Sarah felt she'd lost? As Sarah sat there, questioning her resolve, the door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was tall, with wavy dark hair, casually dressed but effortlessly put together in a way that made her stand out. Sarah watched as the woman checked her phone, looked around, and then leaned against the wall, her expression a mixture of impatience and nervousness. Something in Sarah's gut told her this was the one. Without thinking, Sarah's hand went to the car handle, pushing the door open. She stepped out, every nerve alive as she forced herself to look casual, to breathe evenly. What was she doing? She could still turn back, get back in the car and leave, maybe even pretend none of this had happened. But she kept walking, her mind strangely calm as she approached. Then, as though on cue, Sarah veered slightly too close, accidentally brushing against the woman's arm. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice laced with apology as she turned to face the woman, forcing a small, polite smile. The woman looked up from her phone, clearly startled, but quickly relaxed. "Oh, it's all right," she replied with a smile, tucking her phone away. "Waiting around here makes it easy to zone out." Sarah's heart pounded, but she steadied herself, acting as if she hadn't a care in the world. "Waiting can be the worst sometimes, right?" she said, feigning an interest in the topic. "Are you waiting for someone special?" The woman's face shifted slightly, a flicker of something hidden crossing her features, but she quickly shrugged, playing it off. "I was supposed to meet someone, but they're, running late," she said with a practiced ease, brushing back a strand of hair. "I'm Sarah, by the way," she said, extending her hand, making sure her voice sounded as genuine as possible. She didn't miss the slight hesitation before the woman took her hand. "Emma," she replied, smiling politely. "Nice to meet you, Sarah." As they shook hands, Sarah's mind raced, desperate to make this connection stick. "Well, Emma," she said, leaning into the chance she'd just created, "it's always nice to meet someone new. Waiting around alone isn't exactly fun." Emma laughed, a soft, genuine sound, and Sarah felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Here she was, chatting with the very woman her husband had been spending his evenings with. They chatted easily, Emma seeming relieved to have someone to pass the time with. As their conversation continued, Sarah noticed the way Emma's face lit up, her guard lowering just slightly. It didn't take long for Emma to start venting about her mysterious relationship, hinting at the complications and frustrations without mentioning Greg's name. Emma talked about how her man was married, how he kept promising he'd make things right soon. Sarah's heart clenched, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Sometimes," Emma admitted with a sigh, "it feels like he's torn between two worlds, me and his wife, who he says doesn't even care about him anymore. He says she's always busy, and he feels so, I don't know, invisible." Sarah's stomach dropped, her heart aching as the pieces came together. This was the story Greg had been feeding Emma, painting himself as the victim, misunderstood and neglected. It was a lie so easy to believe, and in a way, Sarah understood why Emma had fallen for it. Who wouldn't sympathize with someone claiming to be unloved, lonely, lost? It was the perfect trap, and Greg had set it up meticulously. Despite the nausea creeping up, Sarah nodded along, letting her sympathetic gaze do the work. Inside, though, she was seething. "That must be so difficult for you," she said softly. "It sounds like you're really putting a lot into this." Emma shrugged, her voice turning wistful. "Sometimes I think maybe I'm crazy. I mean, a married man, right? But he just has this way about him, you know? He makes you feel like you're the only one who really understands him." Her eyes sparkled with a mix of excitement and doubt, and Sarah wondered if Emma even knew how deeply she'd fallen. Sarah gave a tight smile. "Sometimes, love just finds us in the strangest places," she said, her voice as hollow as she felt. She could feel her blood turning cold, the pain sharp and numbing all at once, but she forced herself to stay. The stakes were high, and she wasn't about to give up the advantage of this chance meeting so soon. The minutes stretched on as Sarah gently encouraged Emma to open up, asking questions that felt harmless but would give her more insight. Emma's guard fell further, and Sarah found herself listening to details she wished she didn't have to hear. Emma described the way Greg made her feel cherished, how he spoke about his life as if it were just waiting for something new, something better. Her words were filled with hope, a kind of bright naivety that made Sarah sick. Finally, after nearly an hour of conversation, Sarah realized she'd gotten all she could, at least for today. She needed to retreat, to process everything she'd learned. "Well, Emma," she said, forcing a casual tone, "maybe fate wanted us to meet today. I don't live far from here. Maybe we could meet up sometime? Coffee?" Emma's eyes lit up, almost grateful. "That would be nice, actually," she replied, exchanging numbers without hesitation. As they parted, Sarah felt a strange, hollow satisfaction. She was in, with a connection established. But the cost had been painful, each word and glance a cruel reminder of Greg's betrayal. As she watched Emma walk away, she knew this was only the beginning. Chapter 4. Learning the Lies. In the days following their accidental meeting, Sarah and Emma's budding friendship grew quickly. To Emma, Sarah was just a sympathetic woman she'd met by chance, a woman who listened to her fears and dreams with genuine warmth and interest. But for Sarah, each conversation was a minefield, where every word threatened to crack her composure. It was during one of their mid-morning coffees that Emma first mentioned Greg in passing, calling him the man who changed her life. She spoke of him almost reverently, her face lighting up with every detail, painting a picture of a devoted, misunderstood man trapped in a loveless marriage. "Sarah, it's heartbreaking, really. He's tried so hard, but his wife," she shook her head, "she barely even looks at him anymore. It's like she's just gone." Emma's voice softened, her eyes distant. "He told me once that he felt like he was just a ghost in his own home." Each word struck Sarah like a physical blow, but she kept her expression neutral. She nodded along, letting Emma's words wash over her, feeling a strange mix of fury and heartbreak. Greg had rewritten their history, twisted her devotion, and cast her as some cold, unfeeling wife. She could barely stomach it, but for the sake of her plan, she held her silence, hiding her anger beneath a layer of carefully crafted concern. "Oh, that must be so painful for him," Sarah said, a bitter edge to her voice she hoped Emma wouldn't notice. "He sounds like he's carrying a lot on his shoulders." "He really is," Emma replied, nodding. "And he's such a good man. He just needs someone who can really see him, you know? Someone who understands him." She hesitated for a moment, her voice growing quiet. "I don't think his wife's even touched him in years, Sarah." Sarah forced herself to breathe evenly, her fingers digging into her coffee cup. Greg had always been affectionate, and they'd shared so many loving moments, even in recent years. But here he was, painting her as some distant stranger, all to justify his affair. It hurt more than she'd expected, that he'd tarnish everything they'd shared just to make his own actions seem noble. "That's awful," Sarah managed, her voice steady. "I'm glad he has you, though. It sounds like he finally has someone he can be himself with." Emma smiled, her face lighting up with relief. "Thank you, Sarah. It's hard to talk about, but he's just so special to me." Inside, Sarah seethed. Each compliment Emma offered Greg only fueled her anger further. She was listening to a woman in love with a man who didn't really exist, someone crafted out of Greg's need for validation and Emma's desperation to be loved. But she kept her composure, knowing that exposing him outright would ruin everything she'd planned. Chapter 5. The Details That Cut. Their next coffee date took place in a quiet cafe a few blocks from Emma's office. The conversation that day felt different, more intimate, as though Emma was finally ready to share the parts of her life she normally kept hidden. Sarah could sense the shift and leaned in, hoping this would reveal something new about Greg. "I love him, Sarah," Emma began, stirring her latte absently, "but it's not all perfect." She hesitated, looking almost guilty. "Sometimes he can be a little full of himself, I guess. He's always talking about how much he sacrifices, how his life could have been different if it weren't for his wife." "Really?" Sarah said, suppressing the flash of satisfaction that came with hearing Emma's frustration. She knew that side of Greg all too well, how he could become self-centered, expecting praise for every minor effort. Emma was discovering the cracks in Greg's facade, cracks Sarah knew all too well. "That sounds like it could be exhausting," she added, playing the part of a sympathetic friend. Emma nodded, a slight frown on her face. "It is, sometimes. He complains so much about her, and part of me gets it. I mean, she sounds distant, and he deserves to feel loved. But it's almost as if he's addicted to that story, you know?" Sarah took a steadying breath, feeling an odd satisfaction despite the pain. Emma was seeing glimpses of the real Greg, even if she didn't fully realize it yet. Her own anger was tempered by a sense of justice. Greg's mask was slipping, even with the woman he was trying so hard to impress. "It sounds like he's carrying a lot of resentment," Sarah observed carefully. "That must weigh on you too, though." Emma sighed, nodding. "I know, but then he'll turn around and be so sweet, so attentive. He always makes me feel like I'm the only person who matters to him." Her smile softened, tinged with a sadness that Sarah suspected Emma hadn't even recognized yet. Sarah watched Emma closely, noting every flicker of doubt. She wanted to plant seeds of truth, to gently steer Emma towards seeing Greg as he truly was. But she knew she had to be careful, subtle, like a slow drip of water that would eventually wear down stone. "Sometimes," Sarah said gently, "people can be different depending on who they're with. Maybe he just needs to feel validated, and you're giving him that." She knew it was a dangerous path, but if Emma could start seeing Greg's neediness, his self-absorption, she might begin to see him differently. Emma was silent for a long moment, a hint of frustration crossing her face. "It's strange, though. When we're together, it's wonderful, but sometimes I feel like I'm just helping him cope with his own problems." She shook her head, laughing at herself. "I sound ridiculous, don't I?" "Not at all," Sarah replied, forcing herself to sound supportive. hiding the satisfaction she felt. It's natural to want to understand him, especially if you're investing so much of yourself. Emma sighed, stirring her drink thoughtfully. I just wish I knew what he really wanted. Sometimes it feels like he's in love with this idea of escape more than he is with me. She looked at Sarah, her eyes betraying a vulnerability that, despite everything, made Sarah feel a pang of sympathy. I think he's lucky to have someone who cares as deeply as you do, Sarah said, her voice gentle. But don't lose sight of yourself in all of this. If he truly loves you, he should want to meet you halfway. Emma's expression softened, and Sarah could see she was mulling over her words. Thank you, Sarah. You always know what to say. Sarah offered a tight smile, hiding the satisfaction she felt. She had helped Emma glimpse a small piece of Greg's true nature, nudged her gently toward questioning his intentions. It was subtle, but it was enough for now. As she watched Emma across the table, she felt the small flicker of a victory. Greg's narrative was beginning to fray, piece by piece. Sarah knew she'd have to wait longer for the full truth, but for now, she was content. Emma was starting to see the man behind the mask, the man who had crafted a story of neglect to justify his betrayal. And soon, Greg would face the consequences of the lies he'd built so carefully. For now, she had time. Time to wait, to watch, and to let Greg's lies unravel on their own. Chapter 6. The Dinner Party Plan. The plan had taken shape slowly, over weeks of quiet, relentless planning. Sarah had wrestled with every emotion possible, from the deepest sorrow to the fiercest rage, and in the end, she realized she couldn't settle for an impulsive confrontation. No, she wanted something precise, something he couldn't deny or wriggle his way out of. The idea for an anniversary dinner had come to her in a moment of inspiration, a private event with just enough pomp to lure him in and enough shock to leave him shattered. The invitations went out 2 weeks prior, each one carefully designed to fit its recipient perfectly. For Greg, it was a note from a mutual friend, inviting him to a small, private event in celebration of their anniversary, but kept vague, with just enough detail to pique his curiosity. She knew he wouldn't suspect her, not when he assumed she was utterly oblivious. For Emma, the invitation was different, an elegant, handwritten card left in her purse after one of their coffee dates. It read, "A night to remember, celebrating love and new beginnings." Emma had texted Sarah almost immediately, thrilled and curious about who had invited her. Sarah had shrugged it off with feigned surprise, suggesting it might be a secret admirer. Emma's excitement was palpable, and it only served to fuel Sarah's determination. She spent days meticulously planning every detail. The restaurant she'd chosen was tucked away on a quiet side street, a place known for its intimate atmosphere, dim lighting, and reputation for discretion. She knew the owner well, having attended functions there in the past, and after a brief conversation, the restaurant was secured for a private booking. Sarah thought through every angle. She booked a central table with a full view of the room, arranging it so that she would be the first face Greg and Emma would see upon arrival. She even spent hours curating the slideshow she planned to display, a carefully crafted journey through their marriage. It started innocently enough with photos from their early years, vacations, birthdays, their wedding, then transitioned into more recent images that hinted at the growing rift between them. But the final images, the ones that would linger in the minds of everyone who saw them, were of Greg and Emma together, laughing, holding hands, completely oblivious to the camera hidden across the street. Every detail was tailored to maximize impact. She wanted this to feel like a celebration until the very last moment when it would all unravel. Chapter 7. Setting the scene. On the night of the event, Sarah arrived early. Dressed in a sleek, understated dress, she walked through the restaurant's entrance, her heels clicking against the polished wooden floor. The atmosphere was perfect, low lights, soft jazz playing in the background, the warm glow of candles flickering at every table. The anticipation was a strange calm that steadied her nerves, making her feel more in control than she had in months. As she set up the slideshow projector, she felt the weight of what she was about to do. She was prepared to lose everything that night, to rip the last pieces of her marriage to shreds in front of both the man she'd loved and the woman he'd betrayed her with. but there was a strange satisfaction in knowing that she'd orchestrated every second of it. This was her story to tell now. A quick check with the staff confirmed that everything was in place. The table was perfect, dressed in white linens and adorned with a single, elegant floral arrangement. She double-checked the seating chart, ensuring that Greg would face the screen directly, with Emma seated just to his left, in full view of the slideshow. Then, she waited. The first to arrive was Emma. She stepped into the restaurant with wide eyes, looking every bit the eager, unsuspecting guest. Sarah approached her with a warm smile, hugging her like an old friend. "Emma, you look beautiful," she said, pulling her close. Emma laughed, a little nervous but obviously excited. "This is such a surprise. Thank you for inviting me, though I still don't know what we're celebrating." Sarah smiled, gesturing to the table. "Oh, just a little something special. You'll see." She guided Emma to her seat, pouring her a glass of wine and keeping the conversation light, all while watching the clock. A few minutes later, the door opened again. Greg walked in, his usual confident stride faltering when he saw her standing there. For a moment, Sarah felt a strange sense of pity for him. He looked genuinely happy to see her, oblivious to the storm about to break. "Sarah, what's all this?" he asked, looking around, clearly trying to piece together the situation. She gave him a serene smile, taking his hand and leading him to his seat without a word. As she did, she noticed his eyes flick to Emma, widening slightly in recognition. Sarah didn't miss the brief flash of panic that crossed his face before he quickly masked it with a smile. The two greeted each other awkwardly, each pretending not to know the other in any intimate way, dancing around the truth like children caught in a lie. Once they were seated, Sarah took a step back, standing beside the projector with a remote in her hand. She raised her glass in a toast, her voice calm, steady. "I wanted to thank you both for being here tonight. This evening is special to me, and I'm so grateful to share it with two people who mean so much." They each raised their glasses, though Emma looked puzzled, and Greg's gaze shifted uneasily from Sarah to the screen. Without further delay, Sarah pressed the remote, and the first slide appeared. It was a simple photo. She and Greg on their wedding day, young and beaming, staring at each other as if no one else existed. She could see his face soften as he looked at it, nostalgia flickering in his eyes, and she felt a pang of bitterness. He looked like he was trying to remember what it felt like to be that man, the one who had made promises he was now so willing to break. The next few slides were more of the same. Holidays, birthdays, little snapshots of their life together. Sarah could feel Greg relax as he saw them, his shoulders loosening, his smile growing as the memories rolled by. Then the tone of the images began to shift. The photos became less joyful, more formal. Posed shots at family gatherings, strained smiles at events they'd attended out of obligation. Greg's expression grew puzzled, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of where this was going. And then the slide changed again. This time, it was a photo taken only a few weeks prior, of Greg and Emma, holding hands outside the very restaurant where they'd met tonight. She heard a sharp intake of breath from Emma, and Greg's face went pale, his hand frozen mid-reach toward his wine glass. The slideshow continued, revealing picture after picture of their secret meetings. Sarah watched as Greg's mask crumbled, his composure shattering with each new image. Emma's face drained of color as the reality of what was happening sank in, her eyes darting between Greg and Sarah, desperate to explain but unable to find words. Sarah's voice was low and steady as she addressed them both, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "I wanted you both to know how grateful I am for everything you've done," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "This evening really is a celebration, after all, a celebration of truth." And with that, she stepped back, letting the final images play out, the silence heavy as both her husband and his mistress confronted the reality they had tried so hard to keep hidden. Chapter 8. The confrontation begins. Sarah's hand hovered on the door to the private room, feeling the edges of her carefully crafted plan. She had arrived an hour early, making sure every detail was perfect, the dim lighting, the candles flickering just so, and the table set for three with a view of the screen. Everything was in place, and now it was only a matter of waiting for the players to take their places. Emma arrived first, smiling widely as she entered, a hint of nervous excitement in her eyes. She wore a delicate, blush-colored dress, her hair styled in soft waves. The innocence in her expression was palpable, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah felt a twinge of pity. Emma had no idea what was waiting for her, no inkling that she was about to confront the truth that would upend her image of Greg and of Sarah. But then, she remembered Emma's role in Greg's lies, how Emma had clung to a stolen romance that didn't belong to her. The pity dissolved, replaced by a cold resolve. "Emma!" Sarah greeted her warmly, pulling her into a quick hug, smiling as she felt Emma relax. "I'm so glad you could make it." Emma beamed, glancing around at the private room and the elegant table settings. "This is beautiful, Sarah. Really. I had no idea what to expect. But this," she trailed off, looking a little breathless. Sarah waved it off with a modest smile. "Oh, I just wanted tonight to be special. It's always nice to celebrate love, don't you think?" The words were carefully chosen, and she saw a glimmer of understanding flicker in Emma's eyes. "Yes, it really is," Emma replied softly, her eyes shining with some private hope, a quiet confirmation that she, too, believed tonight would hold something special. Sarah bit back a bitter smile, knowing that Emma's fantasies would soon crumble before her. Then the door opened, and Greg entered. The sight of him in that moment, the surprise that turned into shock, the flash of worry in his eyes as he took in Sarah and Emma sitting together, was better than Sarah had imagined. She kept her expression calm, smiling as though she were just happy to see him, her eyes betraying nothing. "Greg!" She greeted him with a familiar warmth that put him at ease for just a second. He crossed the room toward her, looking like he was still trying to piece together the purpose of this gathering. "Sarah, this is—" His voice trailed off, and he looked over at Emma, whose wide, innocent smile was met with a guarded, uneasy grin from him. "Surprise," Sarah said with a small laugh, guiding him to the table, gesturing for both of them to sit. "I just thought tonight deserved a little celebration. Our love story has been so unique, after all, and it's important to remember the journey we've been on." She reached for the bottle of wine and poured a glass for each of them, watching with satisfaction as Greg's face tightened, his discomfort beginning to show. Emma, sensing the tension but clearly not understanding it, picked up her glass with a slightly confused smile. "This is wonderful, Sarah. Thank you for inviting me." Her gaze flickered to Greg, a small, nervous smile on her lips. "Oh, you know," Sarah said with an easy smile, "I wanted both of you here. I mean, you've both been such a big part of my life." She raised her glass, clinking it against theirs before taking a small sip, savoring the moment. Greg's hand twitched slightly, and he avoided Emma's gaze, focusing instead on his glass as if it were his lifeline. His nervousness was growing, barely hidden beneath his practiced charm, and Sarah could feel it settling into the room like a fog, darkening the mood even as she kept her voice light and cheerful. "So," she continued, putting her glass down and glancing at the projector set up just behind her, "I thought it would be a nice touch to go down memory lane tonight. Pictures are such a beautiful way to remember the best moments, don't you think?" Greg's face froze, his eyes widening. "A slideshow?" he asked, his voice a touch too high. "Yes," she replied smoothly, not missing a beat. "Just a little something I put together. I hope you both enjoy it." Greg's hands tightened around his glass, and Emma, still oblivious, nodded in enthusiastic agreement. "I'd love that, Sarah. I can't wait to see it." Sarah took the remote control in hand and dimmed the lights slightly, her fingers feeling strangely steady as she pressed the button, starting the slideshow. The first photo flickered onto the screen, a glowing image of her and Greg on their wedding day, locked in a kiss, surrounded by family and friends. Greg let out a slight, relieved sigh, but Sarah caught the tension lingering in his eyes. The next few slides were similar, each a snapshot of a life built together. Vacations, birthdays, celebrations. Sarah noticed Greg and Emma relaxing, their suspicions fading as the photos continued. But she had carefully arranged each image, knowing the reveal would come like a wave, catching them completely off guard. Gradually, the tone of the photos shifted. The laughter faded, and the smiles looked forced, their postures stiffer, as if they were only going through the motions. Sarah could feel the room tensing, could see Greg's discomfort growing as he glanced from the screen to her, trying to gauge her intent. Then the next slide appeared, and everything changed. Chapter 9. The slide reveal. It was a picture of Greg and Emma, taken outside a cafe across town. The two of them were laughing, holding hands, unaware that anyone had been watching. Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as her face drained of color. Greg's expression turned to stone, his body rigid with shock. Sarah's voice broke the silence, smooth and steady, her tone holding just a hint of something darker. "I remember when you told me you were going on that business trip, Greg," she said, her voice carrying an edge of irony. "I suppose this was part of that business, wasn't it?" Greg tried to respond, his mouth opening, but no words came. The silence hung heavily between them, broken only by Emma's soft, horrified whisper. "Sarah, But she couldn't finish, the realization of Sarah's deception dawning on her, her face a mixture of guilt and betrayal. The slideshow continued, each new photo hitting harder than the last. Another picture of Greg and Emma in a secluded park, heads close together as they whispered and shared a kiss. Then another, of them dining at the restaurant where Sarah had first found the receipt. Their expressions relaxed, unaware that their secret was being documented in that very moment. With each slide, Sarah narrated, her voice calm and composed, each statement a carefully sharpened blade. "I remember when we talked about trust," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "How important it was, how it meant everything. It's amazing, really, how you can spend years with someone and still discover new things." Her eyes shifted to Emma, her voice softening slightly. "And Emma, you were such a supportive friend. I couldn't have gone through these months without you." Emma's face twisted with horror, the realization cutting deeper than Sarah had anticipated. She turned toward Greg, betrayal burning in her eyes. "You lied to me, Greg," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You said she was distant, cold, that you felt nothing for her." Greg's face was ashen, his hands trembling as he struggled to find words. "Emma, But Sarah cut him off with a quiet, calm smile, her gaze deadly. "Funny, isn't it? How easily one lie turns into another. I wanted tonight to be special, after all, and it looks like it's everything I hoped it would be." She reached forward and poured herself another glass of wine, savoring the silence as Greg and Emma sat, trapped in the wreckage of the lies they had built together. The slideshow continued, each new image a final nail in the coffin. Emma looked down, her face flushed with shame, while Greg's eyes remained fixed on Sarah, filled with a desperation that came far too late. "Cheers," Sarah said softly, raising her glass, a slight smile on her lips. "To love and to truth." And with that, she drank, savoring the taste of her victory, knowing that Greg and Emma would remember this night, and her final, quiet triumph forever. Chapter 10. Emma's Twist. For a few moments, silence stretched across the table. Sarah took a steady sip of her wine, watching Greg and Emma reel from the impact of her revelations. She felt a wave of satisfaction ripple through her, knowing she had delivered her justice with a perfect, merciless precision. But then, something shifted. Emma, flushed and visibly upset, didn't turn her anger towards Sarah as she had expected. Instead, she focused on Greg, her jaw clenched and her gaze filled with fury. Her hands were shaking as she put down her wine glass, and in a trembling voice, she addressed Greg with a simmering intensity. "Greg," she began, her voice low but laced with contempt, "you lied to me." Greg looked like a trapped animal, his mouth opening to protest, but Emma cut him off, her voice rising. "You told me she didn't care about you, that you were in a loveless marriage, that I was the only one who made you feel alive." Her voice cracked, the anger and embarrassment coloring her cheeks a bright, furious red. "And all this time, you were just playing me." "Emma, no, you don't understand," Greg stammered, reaching out to her, desperation flashing in his eyes. "Oh, I understand perfectly now." Emma's voice was cutting. sharp with the kind of betrayal that comes from realizing she'd been nothing more than a pawn in his selfish game. You really had me convinced I was special, didn't you? But look at you, sitting there like a coward while your wife confronts us with everything. She laughed, a bitter sound. And you know what? I didn't even care about you that much. Greg's face fell, his eyes wide with disbelief. What do you mean? Emma folded her arms, the cold fury in her expression so intense it was almost chilling. You were just a distraction for me, Greg. Did you think you were my entire world? That you were the only man in my life? She laughed again, a little louder, her voice filled with scorn. I was seeing someone else too. A real man who doesn't hide behind lies and excuses. Greg looked as though the ground had dropped out from under him. The color drained from his face, and he stared at Emma, struggling to comprehend what she was saying. Emma, you were seeing someone else? Yes, she replied, crossing her arms defiantly, her tone dismissive. He's honest, he's not married, and he doesn't treat me like some fool who'll just wait around for him to figure things out. She glanced at Sarah, her face filled with a kind of pained respect. And unlike you, he doesn't have a wife he's lying to. The satisfaction that Sarah had been feeling a moment ago deepened, turning into something else, an unexpected vindication. Greg's face was a mask of shock and betrayal, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to form a response, but no words came. He was caught in his own web, betrayed by the very woman he'd risked everything for. Emma continued, her tone venomous. You painted this sad little picture of yourself as the victim, Greg, but really, you're just pathetic. And all this time, I was your little escape? You're nothing but a hypocrite, lying to both of us. She gave him a look of utter disdain, one that seemed to strip away every shred of self-worth he had left. Sarah watched, fascinated, as Greg sat in stunned silence, his world crumbling around him. She had thought her reveal would be the final blow, but Emma's confession had taken it further than she could have imagined. The room was heavy with tension, the echoes of their collective betrayals hanging in the air. Chapter 11. The Final Message. With a deep breath, Sarah turned her gaze to Greg, ready to deliver the last words she'd rehearsed in her mind, words she knew he wouldn't forget. Her voice was soft but resolute, carrying a finality that left no room for ambiguity. I never thought I'd find myself here, Greg, she began, her tone quiet yet unwavering. I trusted you, loved you, stood by you. And this is how you repay me. Greg looked at her, his face still pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. Sarah, please, I didn't mean for it to be this way. I just got lost. She shook her head, a slight, sad smile curving her lips. Lost? Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it held a steady conviction. No, Greg, you didn't get lost. You chose this. Every lie, every moment you spent with her, you chose to betray me, to rewrite our life together just to serve your ego. Greg's gaze dropped, shame flooding his face. He looked down, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, unable to meet her eyes. But Sarah wasn't finished. You created this whole story about me, made me into some villain, a woman who didn't love you or care about you, she continued, her voice steady, a strange calm washing over her as she spoke. But I was here the whole time, willing to work on us, to love you through whatever you were going through. You just didn't care enough to see it. Emma sat quietly, watching the exchange with a mixture of guilt and satisfaction. Her confession had been a blow, and now it was Sarah's turn to deliver her own reckoning. The roles were reversed, and it was Greg who was left exposed, stripped of his lies and illusions, his double life crumbling before his eyes. You made me doubt myself, made me question everything about who I was as a wife and a partner. But the truth is, you're the one who failed, Sarah continued, her tone calm, unyielding. You turned away, lied, and tried to escape instead of facing our problems like a man. And now you're left with nothing. Greg swallowed hard, his voice small, filled with desperation. Sarah, please, give me a chance to make this right. But she simply shook her head. There's nothing left to make right, Greg. You shattered it. And maybe this is what you deserve. Her gaze drifted to Emma for a moment, acknowledging the other woman with a hint of pity. In some ways, I think we both deserved better than you. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with the finality of her words. Greg looked utterly defeated, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of regret. But Sarah felt only a strange, liberating calm. She'd said everything that needed to be said, delivered every truth she'd held back for so long. With a steadying breath, she rose from her seat, gathering her bag and sliding her chair back with a quiet finality. She looked at Greg one last time, her expression unreadable. "Goodbye, Greg," she said softly, the weight of a decade's worth of memories hanging in that single word. "I hope someday you understand what you lost." She didn't wait for his response. Without looking back, she walked out of the restaurant, feeling the weight of her heartbreak lift as she left him behind. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. She was no longer bound by Greg's lies, by the weight of his betrayal. She had claimed her dignity, and with it, the freedom to rebuild her life, one step at a time. As she stepped out into the night, the cool air washed over her, and she closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the feeling. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she was walking into it with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. And as she opened her eyes, the faintest hint of a smile crossed her lips. Chapter 12. Unexpected Allies. A week after the fateful dinner, Sarah was surprised to see a message pop up from an unknown number. When she opened it, her heart skipped a beat. It was Emma. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to leave the memories of that evening behind her. But curiosity, and maybe a faint desire to confront the past with a sense of closure, got the best of her. The message was short, apologetic. "Sarah, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I need to talk. I think we both deserve an explanation. If you're willing to meet, please let me know." Sarah hesitated. Every part of her wanted to slam the door on any lingering connection to that night, and yet, the idea of talking to Emma, this woman who had unintentionally become part of her life's most painful chapter, held a certain pull. Emma had, after all, fallen into Greg's web of lies just as she had, a fellow victim, of a man who'd manipulated them both. With a heavy sigh, Sarah typed back a quick response, agreeing to meet at a local park where they could talk privately without the tension of a formal setting. She didn't know what to expect but prepared herself for whatever emotions might come up, knowing she would keep her dignity intact. On the day of their meeting, Sarah arrived early, taking a seat on a bench near the pond, its tranquil waters offering a welcome contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling inside her. A few minutes later, she saw Emma approaching, her face etched with a tentative expression of regret and sadness. They greeted each other with an awkward nod, neither quite knowing how to start. After a long, uncomfortable silence, Emma spoke first. "Sarah, I'm sorry." Her voice cracked slightly. "I honestly had no idea what I was stepping into. Greg, he lied to me. He made me believe things about you that I should never have believed. I didn't realize the extent of his deceit until that night." Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the faint traces of anger flare up before she let them go. "He lied to both of us, Emma. I've had a lot of time to think since then, and I realize now. He used us both to validate himself. He needed someone to believe in his version of reality, and unfortunately, we both did for a while." Emma's eyes filled with remorse, and she looked down, her voice a whisper. "I wanted to believe him so badly. I thought I was saving him from an unhappy life, helping him find happiness again." She let out a humorless laugh, wiping away a tear. "But I was just a pawn." "I know the feeling," Sarah said, a trace of bitterness creeping into her voice. "I spent years trying to be everything he needed, thinking if I just did more, gave more, he'd finally see me, value me." She shook her head, looking away. But in the end, he only cared about himself. A long pause followed, both women lost in their thoughts, the quiet of the park seeming to give them space to process the unexpected emotions. Finally, Sarah spoke, her tone softer. "What happened hurt both of us deeply, but maybe, somehow, we can both learn from it. Find something positive to carry forward." Emma nodded, a faint smile appearing. It's hard to see it now, but I think you're right. I was so blinded by his attention, by feeling needed. I was willing to compromise my own values just to hold on to that feeling. She looked at Sarah with a new, unspoken understanding. I won't let myself fall for that again. Sarah found herself nodding along. Me neither. If there's anything this has taught me, it's that love, real love, doesn't need lies or manipulation. It doesn't make you question your worth or force you to change who you are. She paused, her gaze steady. It should lift you up, not break you down. They sat together in quiet companionship, a silent understanding forming between them. In an odd, bittersweet twist, they found solace in each other, bound by a shared pain that only they truly understood. It was a reluctant alliance, one neither would have chosen, yet both were surprised to find strangely comforting. Before they parted ways, Emma reached out, giving Sarah's hand a quick, sincere squeeze. "Thank you, Sarah," she said softly, "for everything, for your honesty, for this chance to apologize. I know we may never cross paths again, but I'll always remember what you've taught me." Sarah gave a slight nod, feeling a faint warmth she hadn't expected. "Take care, Emma, and be good to yourself." With that, they exchanged one final, quiet glance before going their separate ways, each stepping forward with the faintest sense of hope and closure. Chapter 13. New Beginnings. The weeks that followed were filled with a new sense of freedom Sarah hadn't felt in years. She went through each day without the heavy weight of Greg's betrayal hanging over her, a liberation she hadn't thought possible. She spent more time with friends, reconnected with family, and began exploring interests she had once abandoned, passions she'd put aside to be the perfect wife. She still felt the hurt at times, the moments of loss that struck her like pangs of nostalgia. But now, they were just that, moments. She could acknowledge them, let them pass, and focus on the new life she was building. The pain didn't define her anymore. On one particularly bright Saturday morning, she decided to treat herself to a quiet breakfast at her favorite cafe. She ordered her usual and sat by the window, watching the world go by, lost in her own thoughts. She didn't notice the stranger who took the seat across from her until she heard a soft cough. She looked up to see a man about her age, his face warm with a friendly smile. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, a bit sheepishly. "Every table's taken, and well, you looked like you wouldn't mind the company." Sarah hesitated, feeling a flicker of the old guardedness that had protected her so well recently. But something in his gaze, a gentleness, perhaps, or maybe a genuine openness, made her feel safe. She smiled, nodding for him to sit. They struck up an easy conversation, laughing over shared observations about the busy crowd and the antics of the cafe's eclectic customers. Sarah found herself relaxing, enjoying his company without any expectations or doubts. For the first time, she didn't feel like she had to guard herself or be anything other than who she was. As they talked, she realized that this was what she had been searching for all along. Simple companionship, mutual respect, a lightness that wasn't weighed down by lies or deception. It was a new beginning, one built on her own terms, with a strength and dignity she had reclaimed. The afternoon passed in a blur of laughter and easy conversation, and as they said goodbye, she felt a sense of hope bloom in her chest. She wasn't ready for anything serious, but it was nice to know she could open herself up to life again, slowly, without the scars of the past holding her back. As Sarah walked away, a smile played on her lips, the morning's conversation replaying in her mind. She felt a quiet pride, a sense of empowerment that had grown within her since that night in the restaurant. She had faced the darkest parts of herself, confronted her fears, and walked away from the ruins of her past with her head held high. In the end, her journey hadn't been about revenge or even forgiveness. It had been about rediscovering her own strength, reclaiming her self-respect, and letting go of a love that had broken her. She was free now, no longer bound by the hurt that Greg had inflicted or the illusions she had clung to. And as she stepped into her future, she knew that whatever came next, she would face it with resilience, dignity, and a self-worth that no one could ever take from her again.